Hey there, fellow comic fans. As always, I'm Scott Harris King, and today, just a brief video because we're about to hit the public domain apocalypse. And I wanted to talk just a little bit about a couple things you want to be aware of so you don't get destroyed by the public domain apocalypse. Before we get into there, speaking of public domain, the new issue of my comic series, The Crimebusters, is going to be coming out in January. Got the link down below for the pre-launch page for Kickstarter. So if you're interested in indie self-published comics using public domain characters, you can click on the link, go to the Kickstarter, hit the notify me on launch button to make sure that you don't miss the launch. The series is a continuation of the Crimebuster strip from Boy Comics. So Chuck Chandler is one of the main characters. It continues the continuity. So I'm using that character from public domain. This issue also, they're trying to find Uncle Sam, who I've used in Cthulhu versus Uncle Sam 1 and 2 in the same universe. So we've got that. But also, big thing, and I haven't seen anyone else using this yet. I'm sure people that are out there using these characters, and more people will be, but I haven't seen them yet. There's a cameo, small guest appearance in this issue, a couple pages, but I had a lot of fun with it. The Hardy Boys are going to be in the Crimebusters number 6. That's because the Hardy Boys are now in the public domain. So on January 1st of each year, a bunch of stuff goes into the public domain. This was not the case for a long time. It used to be the public domain laws were 70 years after something was published. But back in the 90s, there was all this court stuff that extended that for 25 years. There were all these companies like Disney in particular that were worried about losing all of their corporate IPs. And so they had the law change from 70 to 95 years. And that meant for a quarter of a century, nothing in the United States entered the public domain because it was all frozen for an extra 25 years. But a couple years ago, we finally hit the end of that freeze period. And so stuff that should have been in the public domain back in the 90s has finally started entering the public domain. And they enter the public domain on the first of each year. And so this year, 2023, when I'm recording this, stuff that came out in 1927, anytime in 1927, all in the public domain. And one of the things that came out in 1927 is Metropolis, but that's not what I'm using. A couple other big things from 1927, but the big one for me was the Hardy Boys. The first Hardy Boys book came out in 1927. And so since the Crimebusters is sort of my ode to teen detectives, like the Hardy Boys, obviously I was really excited for this, and I immediately wrote them into the next issue of my comic, which is issue 6. So I'm hoping to do more with them in the future. But one of the things that I'm running into, and I think the reason I haven't seen anyone else use it, is because of trademark issues. Now, this is how a lot of companies get around the copyright being out there, is that they heavily trademark as many different aspects of the character, the designs, everything as they can. So there's even, I'm not an expert on this, but I've tried to educate myself as much as possible. Even I'm a little unclear on some aspects of it, but I'm going to try and do my best to help you, because in January 1st of 2028 is the big one, and that's where this stuff is really going to come into play. Much bigger than the Hardy Boys. Now, the Hardy Boys, they have a TV show, they have a series of books. Most of the books are still under copyright, and the important thing is that the name The Hardy Boys is also trademarked. And so you can use the characters as they appear in the original version of the first novel. It was later revised. You can't use the revised version, or you can't use the revisions in it. But if you can get a hold of the first and second novels, the original versions of those, they're both in the public domain. You can use the Hardy Boys as they appeared in the original 1927 books all you want. And then you can make your own changes to jump off from there. But you can't advertise them as the Hardy Boys. So like, you can't have on the logo of your comic, or on the cover of your book, or on the cover of your movie, it can't say the Hardy Boys, because that's trademarked. that's where I'm coming into some questions, because I'm not doing any of that stuff. But then when I'm promoting the comic on videos like this, or more importantly on print, uh, on Instagram or on Facebook, am I violating trademark by telling people that the Hardy Boys are in it? I don't think so, and so I'm doing it anyway. I'm pretty sure the answer is no to that, but it's a little bit of a gray area, because I am technically advertising. I don't know. But the way I'm going to be getting around it is on the cover, on the back cover, it's going to say, I'm going to call them I'm going to call them the original Mystery Boys, and they'll say since 1927. It's going to have the picture of them, and then underneath it's going to have their individual names, Frank Hardy, Joe Hardy, but I'm not going to call them the Hardy Boys on the cover of anything, right? So the big one, it's Mickey Mouse. January 1st, 1928, Mickey Mouse enters the public domain, and I think we're going to see an onslaught of people, or maybe we won't, trying to use Mickey Mouse, because it's the most dangerous thing in the public domain you can do, is try and use Mickey Mouse. But even back in the day, there have been people there's certain things with Mickey Mouse that entered the public domain a while ago, and I'll talk about that in a minute. There were people that have tried to use them. They've been sued. But last year, 2 years ago, we had Winnie the Pooh enter the public domain in 2022. And there was immediately a bunch of stuff with Winnie the Pooh. Most famously and notably, some horror slasher movies where Winnie the Pooh is the killer. But I think it's going to be trickier for Mickey Mouse. So Mickey Mouse, again, you can only use him as he appeared in Steamboat Willie in 1928. So he's got to be that original black and white version of Mickey Mouse. There's certain design elements that the original didn't have. Now, I've heard some people say that even though he's in black and white in Steamboat Willie, that there was some other things from 1928, some kind of merchandise things where he was shown with the red shorts. It's possible on the posters, for instance. But my understanding is he didn't have the big white gloves yet. I haven't looked into it too closely, but the important thing is you have to use Mickey and Minnie, who's also in Steamboat Willie, as they appear in 1928. You can't use any of the later versions visually, and you can't use any of the character personality elements that he developed later. And the other big thing is that you can't call him Mickey Mouse on any advertising or anything. Now, you probably don't need to, because it's so distinctive. And that's where things are getting extra tricky. As I mentioned, Disney and other companies protect things in the public domain by trademarking things. And one sly thing that Disney has been doing, and the big reason I want to make this video, is that they've been, all of a sudden, over the last 5 years or so, they've been using the Steamboat Willie version of Mickey Mouse a lot, that they never used to use, but all of a sudden he's back. And so you start to see, in the newer animated things and different projects that are coming from Disney and Disney Animation, at the beginning, where they have the Disney Animation or whatever, their little production studio logos, not the big one with the castle, but they have a couple others. It's Steamboat Willie, right? It's that version of Mickey Mouse. It's the original black and white Steamboat Willie. And recently there was a big overhaul at the movie studios, which I always call MGM, but now it's called Hollywood Studios because they're not associated with MGM. But the theme park at Disney World, the Hollywood Studios theme park, it used to be that the Great Movie Ride was the center of the park. It was the centerpiece in their replica of the Grauman's Chinese Theater. That ride was taken out a few years ago and was replaced with a Mickey Barnstorming ride, which uses the black and white Mickey from this period. So they've been doing a bunch of things with it. And one of the reasons that they're doing it, it's not just because it's their 100th anniversary. And so they're doing, paying tribute to their past. It's not just because they have cool ideas for a cool ride. It's because they want to use that version of the character in as many high profile things as they can, so they can get additional trademark protection from other people using it. So that's why you're seeing so many, visually seeing so many of the original Mickey Mouse, not just like for decades it was, red shorts, the classic Mickey, but now we're seeing the black and white version again. This is why. They want to have that in their pocket so that if they need to sue someone, they can say, oh, this black and white version of Mickey has now become so synonymous with Disney again that just putting something out with that is actually trademark infringement, even if they're not calling them Mickey Mouse, because it's our corporate logo, it's our corporate symbol. Everybody knows what they're doing. It's hard to say how that would actually go in court, but one thing that's easy to say is they have $100 billion and we don't. So it's just something that you need to be really aware of, that despite it being in the public domain, despite not having the copyright, and despite the fact that it wouldn't seem like there's trademark issues with the character, and there may actually be trademark issues. And then you also have to take into consideration the litigation factor, because there are lots of properties that are in the public domain, and the people that control them do a lot of lawsuits basically just to keep control over something that they don't really have the rights to anymore. The Sherlock Holmes people are like that. There was the famous case where they sued Netflix over Enola Holmes, claiming that there were character personality traits that Sherlock Holmes showed in the movie that he didn't show in the public domain books, because not all of those stories are in the public domain, right? So their argument was basically like, he was too nice in the movie and he didn't become nice until later in the stories. They lost that case, but that's because Netflix has enough money to fight back against stupid lawsuits like that. But other people don't. And so Zorro, is my understanding, is the same way, is that the Zorro people will sue you even though Zorro's in the public domain and anybody can do anything they want with Zorro. But they're basically like, well, we have like 4,000 different trademarks they've taken out on Zorro. So anytime you try and do anything, they will sue you over trademark infringement. And that's how they make their money, right? Because they don't actually control the property. They can't really make any money by, like, for instance, letting a movie studio have they can't do like a development deal where they're like, you will option you the rights so you can, do a Zorro book and movie and you'll give us $10 million. They can't do that because it's in the public domain. So the way they make their money is they sue people over trademark infringement, and then they take their money either by settling out of court or somehow winning some of these lawsuits. And so there's frivolous and it's kind of a ridiculous circumvention of really how the law is supposed to work and what it's meant to do. But there are properties where you just have to be aware that even though they're in the public domain, people will sue you. Now, Disney doesn't need to do that. That's probably not the reason they would be suing someone, but it's not difficult to imagine they would sue people. Disney's had some pretty famous lawsuits in the past over trademark infringement. There was a lawsuit that they did at one point where they forced a daycare center had painted a mural of the Disney characters in their daycare, and they forced them to paint over it because they sued them for trademark infringement. It's ridiculous stuff like that. And so they've been very litigious. I've even heard of cases where at comic book conventions, like down in Florida, or I'm not sure if it was in Florida, but I think it was in Florida. Now that they own Star Wars, I've heard of cases where they've gotten angry at fan art at comic shows because, you know, they're not part of the comics community. They don't know the sort of the unwritten rules of these shows. And so people that have this sort of, you know, you can go down Artist Alley and there's all these fan art artists that make their money by doing prints of characters like, you know, the Avengers and Darth Vader, whatever. And I've heard of cases where they've gone to like the convention organizers and they forced the artists to take down all their stuff, and they threatened to sue them for selling illegal knockoff merchandise, even though that's, you know, again, 90% of the stuff you see in Artist Alley on the prints, everyone's doing it. The comic companies don't care, but Disney does care. At least some people there do. So this is basically what I wanted to make you aware of in terms of Mickey Mouse. Just using Mickey. Yes, the character on January 1st is going to be in the public domain, and I encourage everybody to use the character. But just be careful of how you do it. I'm not planning on using Mickey Mouse anytime soon. I do have a story for Crimebusters in mind for much later down the road where I want them to go to Disneyland, and I haven't figured out how to do that exactly. But one option may be to use the Steamboat Willie Mickey when I need to show Mickey in the comic. But that's getting into some stuff that I don't fully understand yet in terms of using public figures and just sort of like things like buildings and properties and stuff in your work. So however I do it, it'll all be on the interior. I'm going to be very careful not to show anything on the cover or use like Disneyland on the cover or anything like that, because that's all trademarked. But it's something that I'm thinking about, and given how things have gone, like with the Winnie the Pooh, I thought there might be some people out there that are considering using Mickey Mouse when he becomes public domain. I just wanted to make you aware that Disney is using that version of the character a lot to try and tighten their trademark property on it, so that they have a firm ground for suing people for trademark infringement if you use that. So just keep that in mind and be careful how you use the character. And I hope we see a lot of stuff, because there's only, even Disney has, believe it or not, finite resources. I think if we see an onslaught of 10,000 different things coming out all at once that all use that version of Mickey, I think there'll be too much for them to do. And I think in that case, they'll probably just go after a couple of the most high profile ones to try and make an example. But, you know, if we all were to do it, I think we could pull it off. But otherwise, just be real careful with Mickey once he becomes public domain, because that's a minefield and it's waiting to blow up. So, rambled on enough about this. Let me know what you think down below. Again, you can check out the Crimebusters number 6. The link is down below. If you're a fan of stuff like the Hardy Boys, I'm going to do my best to use them in a cool way. And I'll see you next time.